Schools across the state got their preliminary A through F accountability grades this week. It will likely be several more weeks before the data is released publicly. But our State Impact Indiana education team has obtained the data, and the results are dramatic. More than 1/3 of Indiana's schools are considered poor performing, according to the preliminary numbers. My colleague Claire McInerney joins us now to explain what this means for schools and how state leaders might intervene to help those schools receiving failing scores. Thanks, Claire, for being here. First off, can you kind of take us through the numbers and explain how they compare to last year's?
Sure, and I'm going to start with last year's numbers. In 2014, 4% of schools had an F and 6% received D. So about 10% of the state schools were considered low performing. Preliminary numbers show that this year 17% of schools will get an F and 19% will get a D. So that's 36% of the schools considered low performing. That's more than 1/3 of our schools in those lowest rankings.
Now, some have been predicting this drop in grades. Others said, no, this probably wouldn't happen. Do you think people are surprised now that the data shows 1/3 of Indiana's schools are in the lowest performing categories?
Sure. So the number is not what we were expecting. No one really had a hard number of what to expect, but we're expecting lower numbers. Anyone who follows education on a nationwide scale saw this coming. In other states that have done the same thing that Indiana did this year, switched to a new assessment, they saw dramatic dips in those scores. And A through F grades are mainly calculated off I-STEP scores. So it shouldn't have been a surprise. State Superintendent Glenda Ritz has been publicly talking about this for a while. We should anticipate lower scores. We should think about what we should do when it happens. When we switched assessments, Governor Pence did publicly say, I have faith that Hoosier students will be able to stay on par. So at that level, it wasn't as big of a concern.
So what happens to those schools now that are receiving a D or F?
Sure. In year one of getting a D or F, you are put on this track where there's a lot of monitoring and reporting, both at the state and federal level. They require principals and teachers to prove that they can, excuse me, get a school to where it needs to be to improve. The state has influence over their resources like finances, their personnel. They have to do tons of reporting to the state and federal government. And if we have 36% of schools doing that, it'll be really hard for the state to keep up with that large amount of monitoring that would have to happen.
Now, some states have adopted new standards, essentially changed the definition of, is it proficient, to avoid putting so many schools. Is there anything Indiana can do? About 30 seconds.
The federal government has said we can not do accountability, but the governor has nixed that. He wants to issue scores. So Glenda Ritz has put forward an option called hold harmless, where we would issue the grades, but if it's lower than last year's, the school would keep the higher grade. But people are not excited about that. So this data, though, might reignite the conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you, Joe.